welcome back to another lecture for Psych 1. Today we are talking about emotion. By the end of this section, you'll be able to explain the major theories of emotion, describe the role that the limbic structures play in emotional processing, and understand the ubiquitous nature of producing and recognizing emotional expression. So just what is an emotion? In our daily lives, we encounter many emotions that we often use to describe our feelings. An emotion is a subjective state of being that results from the combination of several different components: subjective experience, expression, cognitive appraisal, and physiological responses as well. The process of experiencing emotions is complex and multifaceted, and the order in which components occur is not always clear. Sometimes several components may happen simultaneously. The emotional experience often begins with a stimulus, which can either be external or internal. An external stimulus might include things like seeing an accident on the road, while an internal stimulus could be thinking about a past experience. The way we interpret and respond to a stimulus is influenced by our past experiences, our beliefs, and our values. Emotional expression refers to how we display and communicate our emotions. It can be either verbal or nonverbal, such as facial expressions, tone of voice, or body language. We may also choose to express our emotions through creative outlets like art or music. Cognitive appraisal refers to evaluating the significance of a situation and how it will impact us. It involves assessing the potential outcomes of a situation, considering our abilities to cope with it. Here's where self-efficacy comes in, and determining whether this situation aligns with our goals and values. Emotions also include physiological responses, such as changes in heart rate, sweating, or increased respiration. These responses are often automatic and can be triggered by our perception of the world around us without us even consciously being aware of what we perceived. The terms emotion and mood are often used interchangeably outside of psychology, but they are distinct experiences that are studied by psychologists. When we experience an emotion, it is typically a strong and subjective feeling that arises in response to something that we encounter, a specific stimulus. Whether it's joy, anger, fear, sadness, or any other emotion, it's usually felt consciously and with a sense of intentionality. We can usually attribute our emotions to the event or person that has caused them to come about, like being afraid of a snake or feeling joy when you're with your best friend. Emotions can be triggered by a variety of stimuli, such as the people that you interact with in your day, the events that take place in your day. And what's particularly interesting is that the trigger of your emotion does not need to be physically present, just consciously present. For example, your own thoughts or even recalling certain memories can both have ripple effects on your emotions. Take, for example, you didn't do so well on a past quiz. You think to yourself, oh no, I'll never understand this, and you start to feel down. You think about how everyone in class is doing better than you, and you even start to recall memories of other times you struggled in school. The event itself triggers an emotion, but the initial thoughts you have when you experience this emotion and the thoughts that you have in response to those thoughts will continue to influence how you feel. On the other hand, a mood is a less intense and more prolonged affective state that is not necessarily linked to anything specific. Moods can last for hours or even days, and they're often harder to pinpoint than emotions. They might be characterized as feeling happy, feeling sad or irritable, but there's no clear cause or trigger to these moods. Unlike emotions, moods are not always consciously recognized, and they lack the intentional quality that emotions have. In this chapter, we will explore emotions in more detail, and then later on in the semester, we'll dive into mood and its role in mental health. As I mentioned before, emotional states are combinations of physiological arousal, psychological arousal, and subjective experiences. Together, these are the components of emotion, and our experiences, background, and culture inform our emotions and how we express them. Over time, several different theories of emotion have been proposed to explain how these various components of emotion interact with one another, shedding light on how different people can have very different emotional responses even to the same event. Let's look at some of these theories of emotion. The James Lange theory proposes that emotions arise from physiological arousal. According to this theory, an emotion-provoking stimulus leads to a physiological response, such as increased heart rate, or sweating. And the interpretation of this response by the individual results in the experience of an emotion, like being afraid. As you'll see, the James Lange theory contrasts with other theories, such as the Cannon-Bard theory. Other theorists doubted whether the physiological arousal that occurs with different emotions was unique and distinct enough to result in the wide variety of emotions that we experience. For example, emotions like excitement and fear both have very similar physiological qualities. Rapid heart rate, increased respiration. That's where the Cannon-Bard theory of emotion comes into play. The Cannon-Bard theory suggests that physiological arousal and emotional experience occur simultaneously, but independently of each other. In other words, an emotion-provoking stimulus triggers both the physiological response and the emotional experience simultaneously. The Cannon-Bard theory differs from the James Lange theory, which suggests that physiological arousal precedes the emotional experience. The Schachter-Singer two-factor theory suggests that emotions are composed of two factors: physiological arousal and cognitive arousal. According to this theory, physiological arousal is interpreted in context to produce an emotional response. This theory builds upon the James Lange theory by incorporating cognitive appraisal as a key component in the experience of emotion. Appraisal theory posits that emotions depend on cognitive appraisals of the stimuli that we're encountering. The way an individual interprets or appraises a situation determines the emotional response. Appraisal theory is similar to the cognitive aspect of the Schachter-Singer two-factor theory, emphasizing the role of cognitive processes in the experience of emotion. Constructivist theory, according to Barrett, suggests that emotions are constructed based on predictions and experiences. Emotions are not innate, but are constructed by the brain based on prior experiences and are predictions of what will happen in the future because of our past. This theory challenges the idea of emotions as purely physiological or cognitive responses, suggesting that they are instead constructed based on a combination of factors, including physiological responses and cognitive processes. Zion and Ledoux proposed that some emotions occur separately from our prior cognitive interpretation. Zion suggests that emotions occur before cognitive appraisal, while Ledoux's research on the amygdala highlights the role of the brain in processing fear responses. These views provide an alternative perspective to the relationship between physiological arousal, cognitive appraisal, and emotional experience, suggesting that some emotional responses might even bypass cognitive processing. Let's take a look at these theories in action and related to hopefully a hypothetical event, although frightening. Suppose you're out on a hike one day, the weather is warm and you're enjoying the outdoors, sunshine is shining on your face, and you're taking in the scenery of Southern California's unique desert landscape. There's rolling hills, huge rocks erupting from the ground, and even a few poppies accenting the hillside with their bright orange petals. As you take your time strolling down the path, you stop suddenly, your ears picking up a very distinct sound. A few paces up ahead, a rattlesnake is curled up, and he's looking right at you. The James Lange theory of emotion asserts that emotion arises from physiological arousal. Think back to when you learned about the sympathetic nervous system and how it triggers a fight or flight response when we perceive a threat. In this case, the threat is coming from that rattlesnake that you see just in front of you. Your sympathetic nervous system would immediately activate and cause intense physiological arousal. This would result in your heart racing, your breathing becoming faster and shallower, and according to the James Lange theory of emotion, you would only experience the emotion of fear after this physiological response had taken place. According to the Cannon-Bard theory, however, physiological arousal and emotional experience occur simultaneously yet independently of each other. So when we see that rattlesnake on the path just a few feet ahead of you, you'll feel fear at exactly the same time that your body jumps into its sympathetic fight or flight response. The emotional reaction, according to Cannon-Bard theory, is both separate and independent of the physiological arousal, even though they both occur at the same time. The Schachter-Singer two-factor theory of emotion takes into account both physiological arousal and the emotional experience together. According to this theory, emotions are composed of two factors, physiological and cognitive. In other words, physiological arousal is interpreted in context to produce the emotion you experience. So if we think about the example of crossing paths with a venomous rattlesnake on your hike, the two-factor theory maintains that the snake elicits a sympathetic nervous system activation that is labeled as fear given the context. You're pretty close and it looks like it's about to strike. And our experience of that fear. You know somebody who's gotten bit by a rattlesnake in the past. If you had labeled your sympathetic nervous system activation as joy instead of fear, you would have experienced joy. Perhaps you are a lover of reptiles and you're really excited to see this particular creature on your hike. The Schachter-Singer two-factor theory depends on labeling the physiological experience, which is a type of cognitive appraisal. Lastly, Lazarus's cognitive mediational theory would propose that as we're going along our hike and we see this venomous rattlesnake, we're going to appraise the situation. We know that that snake is poisonous, and thus an emotion is triggered, fear. Our heart starts to pound, we have sweating, our breathing increases, and it's all because we have made an appraisal about that situation. If by chance we were to cross paths with a non-venomous snake and we knew that it was no threat to us, we would appraise the situation as not a threat and experience a completely different emotion. So what support do we have for all of this theorizing? The facial feedback hypothesis proposes that facial expressions can influence emotional experiences. According to this hypothesis, facial expressions send signals to the brain, which in turn influence the experience of emotions. This hypothesis complements theories like the James Lange theory by suggesting that physiological responses such as facial expressions, smile, or frown can actually influence our emotional experiences. You may have heard the phrase "turn that frown upside down" being said to someone who's trying to make a person feel better or change their current outlook on life. And although this statement alone is probably not going to change someone's mood, there is some evidence that our facial expressions play a significant role in determining our emotions. See, the mind doesn't exist in isolation from the body. It's continuously receiving and assessing messages from your body, like how fast your heart is beating, and yes, even your facial expressions. So could suggestions of turning that frown upside down actually make a difference? Well, back in 1988, researchers Strack, Martin, and Stepper put this to the test when they asked two groups of people to watch cartoons. One group was asked to hold a pencil between their lips, forcing their facial expression into that, mimicking a scowl, while the other group was asked to hold a pencil between their teeth, mimicking a smile. And what happened? Well, the smiling group rated the cartoons as significantly more funny than the scowling group. They watched the exact same cartoons, the only difference was their facial expressions. There's more recent research as well, suggesting that suppression of facial expressions lowers the intensity of emotions. In 2010, Havas and colleagues used Botox injections to paralyze facial muscles of participants, thus limiting their facial expressions like frowning. And when this was done to participants experiencing depression, they actually reported less symptoms of depression after their frowning muscles were paralyzed. What other evidence do we have to support all these theories? Well, Schachter and Singer devised a pretty interesting experiment to test their theory. Remember that they believed physiological arousal is very similar across the different types of emotion that we experience, and therefore it's really important that the cognitive appraisal of the situation is critical to influencing the emotion we experience. In fact, it might even be possible to misattribute arousal to an emotional experience if the circumstances were right. In 1962, Schachter and Singer randomly assigned groups of men to receive injections of epinephrine. or adrenaline. This drug resulted in bodily changes that mimic the fight or flight response of a sympathetic nervous system, things like rapid heart rate and increased respiration. However, between the groups of men, only one group was told to expect these reactions as side effects of the injection, and the other group was told either that the injection would have no effects on their physiology or that it would result in a side effect unrelated to fight or flight responses, like maybe itchy feet or a headache. After receiving the injection of epinephrine, the men waited in a room with someone else that they thought was another subject in the research project, but in actuality was a Confederate. The Confederate engaged in scripted displays of either euphoric, joyful, or angry behavior. When these participants who were told that they should expect to feel symptoms of physiological arousal were asked about emotional changes that they had experienced related to either euphoria or anger, they reported none. Interestingly enough, the men who weren't expecting any physiological arousal from the injection were more likely to report that they experienced euphoria or anger as a function of the Confederates' corresponding behavior. They all got the same injection of epinephrine, all experienced the same physiological arousal, but only those who were not expecting the arousal, who could not attribute it to the injection itself, used the context clues from the Confederate, someone else's behavior, to interpret their own arousal as a change in their emotional state. As you know, emotions can feel like very powerful experiences, and it leads you to think, do we have any control over what emotions we feel? The previous theories of emotion suggest that although much of our emotional processing occurs automatically and unconsciously, we still have some degree of control over our emotions, if not merely our responses to these emotions. For example, the James Lange theory suggests that physiological arousal precedes the experience of emotion. While we may not have direct control over our initial physiological responses, like increased heart rate or sweating, we can influence them when we become aware of what we are feeling. For example, relaxation techniques like deep breathing or going for a quick walk so that we expel energy and become tired can help us adjust the body's physiological arousal and thus shift our emotions. The Schachter-Singer two-factor theory and appraisal theory highlight the role of cognitive appraisal in determining our emotional responses. In this regard, we have some control over how we interpret and appraise situations, which can influence the emotions we experience. For example, perhaps you're feeling a little nervous about going up in front of class to present a project, and how you interpret your physiological responses, your heart's racing because you're anxious, or maybe your heart's racing because you're excited, and how you appraise and rationalize the threat of the situation. Maybe your best friend's sitting in the front row, and so you can just pretend like you're presenting to them, and it's not so bad. Both of these will impact whether you feel pumped and excited to present, or you're biting your nails in the corner, dreading getting up in front of everyone. For another example of the impact of cognitive appraisal and emotion, imagine you receive constructive criticism on a project at work. Your boss pointed out several mistakes that you made. But instead of feeling ashamed and discouraged, you reframe the feedback as an opportunity for growth and improvement. By changing your cognitive appraisal of the situation, you can shift your emotional response from one of disappointment to a more positive emotional response, like feeling motivated and eager to learn from mistakes and do better next time. Automatic emotion regulation, as discussed by Mouse and colleagues, research that was referenced in your online textbook, occurs without conscious effort and helps us regulate our emotions. This suggests that while we may not actively control every aspect of our emotional response, there are automatic processes in place to help us manage them. AER can be seen as a mechanism through which individuals regulate their emotions based on cognitive appraisals, aligning with the appraisal theory and the cognitive aspect of the Schachter-Singer two-factor theory. AER refers to the unconscious control of emotions, influencing our attention, appraisals, and behaviors related to those emotions. It's a process that occurs automatically, without requiring us to actively think about it. It's like having a built-in system that helps us navigate our feelings without having to actively think about it. Imagine it as a mental autopilot that kicks in to guide your emotional responses. Take, for example, you're driving to an important job interview and suddenly you encounter heavy traffic. You feel frustration and stress starting to build. There's a few automatic responses that might happen. Maybe you respond by clenching your jaw, gripping the steering wheel, and really laying on your horn or shouting, "This can't be happening today." Or maybe you remind yourself that it's all right, there's alternate routes that you can take. AER would kick in automatically. You'd respond to your emotions without needing to actively think about it, and your response would depend on how you've learned in the past to handle these different emotions. If you've learned more adaptive AER responses, then you'd likely stay focused on finding those alternate routes, remain composed during the interview, and handle the situation calmly. If you'd learned more maladaptive AER responses, then perhaps you'd stay upset and angry, end up arriving even later to the interview, greet the receptionist with a scowl, and answer questions in an agitated tone because you weren't able to successfully regulate your frustration from earlier. We can, of course, exert conscious effort to regulate our emotions, which is the entire premise behind therapeutic techniques such as cognitive behavioral therapy. This might involve using cognitive strategies like reframing thoughts, or behavioral strategies like engaging in activities that uplift your mood, or seeking out social support of friends or family members who make you feel better simply by being around them. Let's take a look at emotions inside the brain. In the biopsychology module, you learned about the limbic system, which is the area of the brain involved in emotion and memory. The limbic system includes your hypothalamus, thalamus, amygdala, and hippocampus. Remember, Ledoux's research in neuroscience of emotion suggested that some emotions do not require any cognitive interpretation. According to him, certain emotions bypass contextual interpretation altogether, and he discovered that the amygdala plays a crucial role in our experience of fear and triggering the fight or flight response. When a stimulus triggers fear, it's detected by the brain. It is initially processed through the thalamus, the region responsible for relaying sensory information. The thalamus acts as that relay station, sending the sensory information to other parts of the brain for processing. The brain processes this fear stimulus through one of two pathways. The first pathway is a direct route from the thalamus to the amygdala. This pathway is quick and it provides a speedy response to the fear stimulus. The amygdala can receive the information within milliseconds and trigger a fear response even before we're consciously able to recognize that a threat is present. The second pathway is a more complex route that involves the thalamus sending the stimulus to the cortex for more detailed processing. The cortex, the outer area of the brain, is responsible for your higher order thinking, such as your perception, your awareness, your decision making. In the cortex, the brain can analyze the fear stimulus in more detail, appraise different contexts that it's present in, evaluate the intensity of the stimulus and its relevance to you. After processing the stimulus in the cortex, the information is then sent to the amygdala, which triggers a fear response if it's warranted. The hypothalamus plays a role in the activation of the sympathetic nervous system that is a part of any given emotional reaction. The thalamus serves as a sensory relay center where neurons project to both the amygdala and the higher cortical regions in the cortex for further processing. The amygdala plays a role in processing emotional information and sending that information onward. And the hippocampus integrates emotional experience with cognition. The amygdala is a complex part of the brain that plays a crucial role in regulating our emotional responses. So let's give it a little more attention. The amygdala is composed of various subnuclei: the basolateral complex and the central nucleus, to be specific. And these two subnuclei have very distinct functions. The basolateral complex is responsible for classical conditioning, which helps us to learn to associate stimuli with particular emotional responses, like the emotions that are triggered when you see a puppy or you smell fresh baked cookies, or the emotions triggered when you see a spider. It also plays a critical role in attaching emotional value to learning and memory processes. The basolateral complex has dense connections with various sensory areas of the brain, allowing it to process and integrate information from different sources. The central nucleus, on the other hand, is involved in regulating attention and arousal. It receives input from the basolateral complex and has connections to the hypothalamus and various brainstem areas to control the activity of the autonomic nervous system and the endocrine systems. This means that the central nucleus plays a role in physiological responses associated with emotional states like increasing your heart rate, sweating, or increasing respiration. Overall, the amygdala is a crucial part of the brain that plays a critical role in our emotional and physiological responses to the world around us. The basolateral complex and the central nucleus of the amygdala work together to process and integrate information from different sources, allowing us to respond appropriately to different stimuli. So what about the expression of emotion? If you think about how you express certain emotions compared to your friends or other family members or people that you know from another country, there's likely to be lots of variance within those examples. Culture can influence the way in which people express their emotions. Cultural display rules are a set of culturally specific norms that regulate the types and frequency of emotional displays that are acceptable. So individuals from different cultural backgrounds may have significantly different cultural display rules for various emotions. For instance, studies have revealed that people in the US tend to express negative emotions like fear, or anger, or disgust both in the company of others and when they're alone. While in other countries, such as Japan, people only express these emotions when they're alone, not when they're with other people. Individuals from collectivist cultures that emphasize social harmony are more likely to suppress their emotional reactions if it means keeping the peace and carefully evaluating which emotional response is most appropriate in a given context. Another example of the variation of an expression of emotion can be found when we look at gender differences in emotional processing. Although studies on gender differences in emotional display are inconclusive, there is some indication that individuals different genders may vary in how they manage their emotions. Think about how you were socialized to respond to emotions, to present emotions in public as a child. Were there expectations that you were to act in a certain way when expressing your emotions, or were you expected to hide them? We've already discussed the outward portrayal of emotions through facial expressions. We also communicate our emotions not just through our words and facial expressions, but through the tone of our voice and other body language. Body language refers to the way we express emotions through body positioning, different actions, and movement. There's also cultural differences in body language. For example, eye contact in the US can be seen as a sign of respect and engaging, or in other cultures, eye contact can actually be seen as a sign of disrespect. Studies show that we're highly attuned to the emotional signals conveyed through body language, even if we're not consciously aware of them. Think for a moment about someone who is upset and angry. Picture them in your mind. What are they doing? How do they look? How are they moving? Now think for a moment about someone who is happy, friendly, joyful. How do they look? What are they doing? You can likely easily bring to mind a clear and distinct image of facial expressions and body positioning in each of these examples because of your complex understanding of body language and how to read it. To wrap up, let's talk about the universality of emotions. When you look at these images, what emotions do you see expressed in their faces? Can you see maybe fear, surprise? Which ones look happy? Which ones look upset? If you were able to identify these specific emotions, that's because there are some emotions that are universal across different cultures. So we have the potential to respond to different emotions in the same context, but how are we universal in our understanding of emotions? Well, Paul Ekman researched this exact topic for several decades and came to the conclusion that despite different cultural display rules, our ability to recognize and produce facial expressions of emotion appear to be universal. In fact, even congenitally blind individuals produce the same facial expressions of emotions despite never having the opportunity to observe these facial expressions in other people. Thus, psychologists have substantial evidence for 7 unique universal emotions that are associated with very distinct facial expressions. These distinct emotions include happiness, surprise, sadness, fright, disgust, contempt, and anger. If you've seen the Pixar movie Inside Out, you can probably distinctly picture the unique qualities of joy, sadness, anger, fear, and disgust. But the startle response of surprise and the dislike of contempt are not so vibrantly illustrated in this movie. So to wrap up, yes, there are some universal emotions that we all experience and can recognize across different cultures. You got to learn about different theoretical understanding of emotions and how the components of emotions interact with each other to help bring us to the conclusion of what we're feeling. And you got to look inside the brain of the important structures of the limbic system that play a role in emotional processing.